The moment the child's small hand slipped into Gavril Morgath's, the Vampire King felt something crack open inside his chest that had been sealed for 3 centuries. He'd been standing in the grand foyer of the Nighthaven estate, discussing territory disputes with his council members, when the little boy had wandered in from the servants' quarters. The child couldn't have been more than 4 years old, with dark curls that fell into curious brown eyes and a smudge of what looked like jam on his cheek. Before anyone could react, the boy had walked straight up to Gavril, looked up at him with absolute trust, and taken his hand. "Daddy," the child had said simply, as though it were the most natural thing in the world. The council chamber had fallen into shocked silence. Gavril's advisors, ancient vampires who had seen empires rise and fall, stared at their king with expressions ranging from confusion to barely concealed horror. But Gavril said nothing. He didn't correct the child. He didn't pull his hand away. Instead, his long fingers, pale as moonlight against the boy's warm skin, had gently closed around that small hand. And neither had the woman who burst into the foyer 30 seconds later, her face flushed with panic and exertion. Kira Harper was new to the estate staff, hired just 2 weeks ago as part of the housekeeping team. Gavril had noticed her immediately, though he'd told himself it was merely because she was different from the usual servants who worked in vampire households. Most humans who took positions in vampire residences were either thrill-seekers drawn to danger or desperate souls with nowhere else to turn. Kira seemed to be neither. She was competent, quiet, and kept her head down, asking for nothing beyond her modest salary and the small apartment in the servants' wing where she lived with her son. Her son. The small boy currently holding Gavril's hand and looking up at him with complete adoration. "Tobias," Kira breathed, her voice tight with fear as her eyes darted from her son to the Vampire King. "I'm so sorry, Your Majesty. He got away from me. He's never done anything like this before." She moved forward to collect the child, but Gavril found himself speaking before he'd fully processed the impulse. "Leave him." Kira froze. Her face had gone pale, making the dark circles under her eyes more pronounced. She was beautiful in an understated way, soft features, honey-colored hair pulled back in a practical bun, and eyes the color of warm whiskey. Right now, those eyes were wide with terror. "Your Majesty, I apologize," she said quickly. "He doesn't understand. He's just a child, and he doesn't know better. Please don't." "I said leave him," Gavril repeated, his voice softer this time. He looked down at Tobias, who was now examining the rings on Gavril's fingers with fascination. "He's done nothing wrong." One of his council members, Lady Seraphine, stepped forward. Her white hair gleamed like silver in the low light, and her crimson eyes narrowed with disapproval. "My lord, surely you don't intend to indulge this situation. The child has shown gross disrespect by addressing you so familiarly, and in front of the entire council, has he?" Gavril's tone dropped several degrees, and Lady Seraphine took an involuntary step back. "I see only a child who wandered into a room, nothing more." Tobias chose that moment to tug on Gavril's hand. "Daddy, you're really tall," he announced with the blunt honesty of young children everywhere. "Can you lift me up? I want to see everything from up there." The council collectively held their breath. Humans did not make demands of the Vampire King, children or otherwise. But Gavril Morgath, who had led his kind through wars and political upheavals for over 300 years, who had personally executed those who disrespected his authority, simply bent down and lifted the small boy into his arms. Tobias laughed with delight, his small hands immediately reaching for Gavril's face. "You're cold," he observed, patting Gavril's cheek. "And really pale. Are you sick?" "Tobias!" Kira's voice cracked with horror. She looked like she might faint. "You can't please Your Majesty. He doesn't understand what you are. I've tried to teach him to be respectful, but he's so young, and how old is he?" Gavril interrupted, still holding the boy securely. Tobias had now moved on to examining Gavril's white hair with fascination. "4," Kira whispered. "He just turned 4 last month, and his father?" The question hung in the air like a blade. Kira's expression shuddered immediately, and Gavril felt a strange surge of anger at whoever had put that look of pain in her eyes. "Gone," she said flatly. "It's just us." Gavril nodded slowly. He could smell the truth on her and something else. Fear, yes, but also a fierce protective instinct that radiated from her like heat. She was terrified, but she would throw herself between him and her son without hesitation if she thought the child was in danger. Something about that stirred a response in him that he hadn't felt in decades, perhaps longer. "The council meeting is concluded," he announced abruptly, his tone brooking no argument. "We will reconvene tomorrow evening." Lady Seraphine opened her mouth to protest, but one look from Gavril silenced her. The council members filed out with varying degrees of reluctance and curiosity, their whispers already beginning before they'd fully cleared the room. When they were alone, or as alone as one could be in a house full of vampires with supernatural hearing, Gavril carefully set Tobias back on his feet. The boy immediately grabbed his hand again. "Daddy, do you have any cookies?" Tobias asked hopefully. Mama said we couldn't have cookies before dinner, but you're really big, so maybe you can have cookies whenever you want. Kira looked like she wanted the floor to swallow her whole. Tobias, this isn't, he's not. She trailed off, her eyes meeting Gavril's. He could see the question there, the desperate confusion. Why hadn't he corrected her son? Why wasn't he angry? Why was he the vampire king standing in his own foyer holding hands with a 4-year-old human child who kept calling him daddy? Gavril didn't have a good answer, or rather, he had several answers, none of which he was ready to examine too closely. There are cookies in the kitchen, he said instead, directing the comment to Tobias. But your mother is right. Dinner should come first. He looked at Kira. Have you eaten? She shook her head mutely. Then you'll both join me for dinner, in the private dining room. It wasn't a request, and Kira seemed to recognize that. She swallowed hard and nodded. Yes, your majesty, but I should change first. And Tobias needs to wash his hands and face, and 20 minutes, Gavril said. I'll have the staff prepare something appropriate for a child. He paused, realizing he knew nothing about what 4-year-olds ate. What does he like? Anything with cheese, Kira said faintly. And he's obsessed with pasta. Your majesty, I really am sorry about all this. I know you must be busy, and we've already disrupted your evening, so if you'd rather we just 20 minutes, Miss Harper, Gavril repeated, his tone firm but not unkind. Don't make me come looking for you. He meant it as a joke, or as close to a joke as he came these days, but Kira's face went even paler. Right. Probably not the best thing to say to a human woman who worked for vampires. Before he could clarify, Tobias tugged his hand again. Will you sit next to me at dinner, Daddy? The boy asked. Gavril looked down at those trusting brown eyes and felt that strange crack in his chest widen a little further. Yes, he heard himself say, I will. 23 minutes later, Kira arrived at the private dining room with Tobias in tow. The boy had been cleaned up, his face scrubbed and his curls still damp at the edges. Kira had changed into a simple blue dress that brought out the color of her eyes, though Gavril suspected that hadn't been her intention. She still looked terrified, but she was holding it together with visible effort, her hand clasped tightly around her son's. The dining room was smaller than the grand hall where Gavril usually entertained visiting vampire dignitaries, but it was still opulent by human standards. Dark wood paneling covered the walls, and a crystal chandelier cast warm light over the table. The staff had outdone themselves, setting out a spread that included pasta with butter and cheese for Tobias, a more elaborate meal for Kira, and a single wine glass filled with dark red liquid for Gavril, blood. He never ate food anymore, though he could if necessary. But he still needed blood to survive, and he preferred to be honest about what he was. Tobias's eyes went wide when he saw the table. Wow, this is like a castle. It is a castle, Gavril said, pulling out a chair for Kira before she could do it herself. Her startled look suggested that vampire kings didn't usually practice such courtesies. Or it was, several centuries ago. We've renovated extensively since then. Several centuries? Kira repeated, settling into her chair with the caution of someone walking on ice. How old are you, if you don't mind my asking? 347. Gavril lifted Tobias into the chair next to his own, noting how the boy's legs dangled well above the floor. He'd have to get a proper chair for children if this was going to become a regular occurrence. The thought that he was already planning for future dinners with them should probably concern him more than it did. I was turned in 1679, during the reign of Charles II. Kira stared at him. That's older than America. Significantly. Gavril took a sip from his wine glass, watching her reaction. Most humans were either fascinated or repulsed when confronted with the reality of what vampires consumed. Kira just looked thoughtful. Does it hurt, she asked quietly. When you drink, I mean, for the person you're drinking from? He finished the sentence she couldn't quite manage. It depends. If done correctly, no. There's actually a mild euphoric effect for the donor. We produce compounds in our saliva that act as both anesthetic and anticoagulant. It's an evolutionary adaptation. Prey that doesn't struggle is easier to feed from. He probably shouldn't have used the word prey, because Kira tensed slightly. But Tobias was already digging into his pasta with enthusiasm, oblivious to the adult conversation happening around him. I've never met a vampire before, Kira admitted after a moment. I mean, obviously I knew you were when I took this position, but I've only ever seen you from a distance. You're not what I expected. What did you expect? She bit her lip, considering. I don't know. Something more. Monstrous, I suppose. You look like you could be carved from marble. Beautiful but cold. Untouchable. She flushed. Sorry, that was probably inappropriate. It was honest, Gavril said. I appreciate honesty. He paused. You still haven't explained why you didn't correct your son when he called me daddy. There it was. The question that had been hovering between them since the foyer. Kira's flush deepened and she looked down at her plate. I was going to, she said quietly. Of course I was. But then I saw your face and you looked, I don't know, not angry. Almost surprised. And Tobias looked so happy and I thought. She trailed off, shaking her head. It sounds stupid. Tell me anyway. She met his eyes, and he saw something vulnerable and honest there. I thought maybe you didn't mind, and I thought maybe, just for a moment, my son could have what he's been missing, even if it's pretend. Gavril felt something twist in his chest. His father, he said. Understanding. How long has he been gone? Since before Tobias was born. Kira's voice was steady, but her hands trembled slightly as she cut her food. He left when I told him I was pregnant. Said he wasn't ready to be a father, that he was too young to be tied down. He was right about one thing: he would have made a terrible father. But Tobias doesn't understand that. He just knows that other kids have daddies, and he doesn't. So when he saw me, he saw someone tall and strong and important looking, and his little brain just decided that's what daddies must look like. Kira's smile was sad. I should have corrected him immediately. I know I should have. You're the Vampire King, and I let my 4-year-old call you daddy in front of your entire council. I could lose my position for that. I could lose worse than that. You could, Gavril agreed and watched her flinch. But you won't. Not for this. Why not? It was a fair question, and one Gavril wasn't entirely sure how to answer. Because the child's hand had felt warm in his. Because something about Kira's fierce maternal protectiveness called to something equally fierce in him. Because he'd spent 3 centuries surrounded by vampires who wanted things from him: power, favor, blood, and here was a human woman who wanted nothing except to protect her son? Because I didn't correct him either, Gavril said finally, and I had every opportunity to do so. Tobias chose that moment to look up from his pasta, a smear of cheese sauce on his chin. Daddy, do you like pasta too? Mama makes really good pasta, but this is even better. Don't tell Mama I said that. Kira's expression wavered between mortification and reluctant amusement. Tobias, you know I can hear you, right? Oh, Tobias grinned, entirely unrepentant. Well, your pasta is good too, Mama, just different good. Gavril found himself fighting back something that might have been a smile. When was the last time he'd smiled? Really smiled, not the cold expression he used during political negotiations. He couldn't remember. I don't eat pasta anymore, he told Tobias. But I remember enjoying it very much when I was human. You were human? Tobias's eyes went huge. Like me and Mama? A very long time ago. I was about 25 when I was turned. What's turned mean? Kira jumped in before Gavril could answer. It means he became a vampire, sweetie. Remember we talked about how some people are different and we should be respectful of everyone? Oh, right. Tobias nodded sagely. So you're different, like how Mama says everyone is special in their own way. Something like that, Gavril agreed. The child's innocent acceptance was oddly refreshing. Most humans who learned what he was either feared him or wanted to use him. Tobias just seemed to think being a vampire was another interesting fact, like being tall or having white hair. They ate in relative silence for a few minutes. Or rather, Kira and Tobias ate while Gavril nursed his blood and tried to remember the last time he'd shared a meal with humans. Not in decades, certainly. Most vampires maintained a strict separation between their kind and humans. There were blood servants, of course, humans who provided sustenance in exchange for protection and payment. But actually socializing with humans, sitting down to dinner like this, it simply wasn't done. Yet here he was, watching a 4-year-old human child eat pasta with more enthusiasm than technique, while the child's mother tried desperately to maintain some semblance of proper etiquette in front of vampire royalty. You can relax, you know, Gavril said quietly to Kira. I'm not going to punish you for your son's table manners. Kira let out a breath she'd probably been holding since they sat down. Sorry, I'm just not used to dining with. She gestured vaguely at him. Vampires, kings, men who your son has decided to adopt as his father? That startled a real laugh out of her, bright and genuine. The sound did something strange to Gavril's chest. All of the above, she admitted. This whole situation is surreal. This morning I was scrubbing floors in the East Wing. Now I'm having dinner with the Vampire King while my son calls him Daddy, and neither of us is doing anything to stop it. Would you like to stop it? The question came out more seriously than he'd intended. Kira studied him for a long moment, her whiskey-colored eyes searching his face for something. I don't know, she said finally. That probably makes me a terrible mother. I should be protecting my son from getting attached to something impossible. You're going to live forever, and we're going to be gone in the blink of an eye for you. Letting Tobias think of you as any kind of father figure is just setting him up for heartbreak when reality crashes down. She was right, of course. Logically, completely right. Gavril should send them back to their apartment right now, should make it clear that this dinner was a one-time courtesy and nothing more. He should reassert the proper boundaries between vampire and human, between king and servant. He should do a lot of things. What if it wasn't impossible, he heard himself ask instead. Kira's fork clattered against her plate. What? Gavril wasn't entirely sure what he was suggesting, which was unsettling in itself. He was always sure. He'd spent 3 centuries being sure, making decisions that affected thousands of vampires in their human territories. But right now, looking at Kira's shocked face and Tobias's cheese-smeared grin, He felt less like an ancient vampire king, and more like the uncertain young man he'd been before he died and been reborn in blood. "I'm not saying I understand this situation any better than you do," he said carefully. "But your son has decided I'm his father, and I didn't hate it, being called that. Having him hold my hand and look at me like I wasn't a monster." "You're not a monster," Kira said quietly. "Monsters don't have dinner with 4-year-olds. Monsters don't look at a woman's son with something almost like longing in their eyes. You barely know me." "True. But I know you could have hurt Tobias for his disrespect. You could have had me fired or worse for letting it happen. Instead, you invited us to dinner and let my son sit next to you while you've been making sure his napkin doesn't fall off his lap every 30 seconds. Had he been doing that?" Gavril glanced down and realized his hand had indeed moved to adjust Tobias's napkin twice without him consciously registering the action. When had he become so attuned to the child's needs? "Daddy, I'm full," Tobias announced, pushing his plate away with a satisfied sigh. "That was really good. Can we come back tomorrow?" "Tobias, you can't just invite yourself," Kira began, but Gavril interrupted her. "Yes." Both of them stared at him. Gavril set down his wineglass with careful precision. "You may come back tomorrow. For dinner, both of you." "Your Majesty, that's very kind, but we couldn't possibly impose. It's not an imposition if I'm requesting it." Gavril stood, moving to Tobias's chair. "May I?" It took Kira a moment to realize he was asking permission to lift her son. She nodded mutely, and Gavril carefully picked up the drowsy child. Tobias immediately snuggled against his chest, apparently unconcerned that Gavril's body temperature was notably lower than a human's. "You're like a big pillow," Tobias mumbled, his eyes already drooping. "A cold pillow. Mama says cold pillows are the best. Your mother is wise," Gavril said, surprising himself with how naturally the gentle tone came. He looked at Kira. "I'll carry him back to your quarters. You don't have to." "I know." Gavril adjusted his hold on the sleeping child, whose small arms had wrapped around his neck with unconscious trust. "But I'd like to." The walk through the estate's corridors to the servants' wing was silent except for Tobias's soft breathing. Other staff members they passed did double takes at the sight of the vampire king carrying a human child, but none dared to comment. Gavril could feel Kira's tension beside him, her confusion and concern radiating like heat. Her apartment was small but clean, clearly organized to make the most of limited space. Children's drawings covered one wall and toys were neatly stored in boxes by the window. A modest kitchen took up one corner and 2 doors presumably led to bedroom and bathroom. It was humble compared to the luxury of the rest of the estate, but it was undeniably a home, warm, lived in, loved. "The bedroom is through there," Kira whispered, pointing. "I can take him." But Gavril was already moving, carrying Tobias through the indicated door into a small room dominated by a child-sized bed covered in blankets decorated with cartoon animals. He laid the boy down carefully, watching as Kira removed his shoes and pulled the covers up to his chin. Tobias stirred slightly, his eyes cracking open. "Night, Daddy," he murmured. "Love you." Then he was asleep again, leaving those words hanging in the air like a benediction and a curse all at once. Kira ushered Gavril back into the main room and closed the bedroom door with shaking hands. "I'm sorry, he doesn't know what he's saying. He's 4 and he's tired, and stop apologizing." Gavril's voice came out rougher than intended. He ran a hand through his hair, feeling oddly off balance. "You apologize constantly, as if loving your son and wanting to protect him is something shameful. It's not that. I just don't want you to feel obligated. I don't do things out of obligation, Miss Harper. I do them because I choose to." He moved closer, noting how her pulse quickened, but she didn't step back. "Brave, or foolish, perhaps both. I'm choosing to have dinner with you and your son tomorrow. I'm choosing to allow him to call me by a title that neither of us have corrected. The question is, what are you choosing?" Kira wrapped her arms around herself, suddenly looking very young and very tired. "I don't understand what's happening here. You're the vampire king. You rule over thousands of vampires across multiple territories. I'm a maid with a 4-year-old son and a high school education. We exist in completely different worlds. Perhaps that's exactly why this is happening," Gavril said quietly. "Because our worlds are so different that we can be honest with each other in ways we can't with our own kind." "What do you mean?" He moved to her small window, looking out at the estate grounds bathed in moonlight. "Do you know what it's like to be surrounded by immortals who all want something from you? Power, favor, influence, blood. Every conversation is a negotiation. Every gesture has political meaning. Every relationship is built on utility rather than genuine connection." He turned back to face her. "And then a 4-year-old human child takes my hand and calls me daddy, simply because I happened to be standing there when he needed someone to hold on to. No agenda, no manipulation. Just pure, uncomplicated trust." "It won't stay uncomplicated," Kira said softly. "Tobias will get attached. I'm already getting attached, and that's terrifying because I don't know what you want from us." "I don't know either," Gavril admitted. "I haven't known what I wanted in decades. But when your son held my hand tonight, I remembered what it felt like to be needed for something other than my crown or my power, to be seen as something other than a king or a monster. He paused. What do you want, Kira? The use of her first name clearly startled her. She was quiet for a long moment, her eyes distant. I want Tobias to grow up happy and safe. I want him to have opportunities I never had. I want him to know what it feels like to have a father who chooses to stay, not because he has to, but because he wants to. Her voice dropped to barely a whisper. And I want to stop being so tired all the time, so scared, so alone. You're not alone anymore. The words hung between them, weighted with implications that Gavril wasn't sure either of them was ready to examine. But they were true. In the space of one evening, something had shifted. The vampire king and the maid with her fatherless son had somehow become entangled in a way that defied logic and propriety. Kira laughed shakily. This is insane, you know that, right? Tomorrow morning I'm going to wake up and realize this was all some kind of stress-induced hallucination. Then I suppose I'll have to prove it's real when I see you for dinner tomorrow evening. Gavril moved toward the door, then paused. 6 o'clock, the same dining room. Wear whatever you're comfortable in. This isn't a formal occasion. What is it then? Gavril considered the question carefully. A beginning, he said finally. What kind of beginning I'm not certain yet, but a beginning nonetheless. He left before she could respond, making his way back through the estate to his private chambers. The corridors were empty now, most of the staff having retired for the night. Vampires didn't sleep the way humans did, but they did rest during the day, conserving energy when the sun made them vulnerable. His chambers were as opulent as expected for vampire royalty, all dark wood and rich fabrics with heavy curtains that blocked any hint of sunlight. A massive 4-poster bed dominated one wall, though Gavril rarely used it. Books lined another wall, centuries of accumulated knowledge on everything from philosophy to modern technology. A desk held the endless paperwork that came with ruling vampire territories across multiple countries. Usually he would spend these hours reviewing reports or handling correspondence. Instead, he found himself standing by the window, looking out at the servants' wing where a young woman was probably lying awake, trying to make sense of the evening's events. You're being foolish, he said aloud to his reflection in the glass. A pale, ageless face looked back at him, framed by white hair that fell past his shoulders, red eyes that marked him as a vampire of considerable age and power, features that humans called beautiful and other vampires called intimidating. She's human. She'll be dead in the blink of an eye and you'll still be here, having to remember what it felt like to lose them. But even as he said it, he knew it wouldn't stop him. Couldn't stop him. That crack in his chest had opened too wide now, letting in something he hadn't felt in so long he'd almost forgotten its name, hope. The next day passed with agonizing slowness. Gavril handled his usual duties, reviewing security reports, meeting with his financial advisors about various investments, settling a territorial dispute between two vampire families in the northern regions. All of it felt colorless and routine compared to the anticipation building in his chest as the sun began to set. At 5:30, he found himself in the private dining room checking on the preparations with an attention to detail that surprised even him. The cook, a vampire named Marcus who had been preparing meals for visiting humans for over a century, gave him a knowing look. Special guest tonight, Your Majesty? The same as yesterday, Gavril said, adjusting the placement of a fork with unnecessary precision. The maid, Miss Harper, and her son. Ah yes, young Tobias. Marcus's smile was genuine. Word has spread about yesterday's dinner. The staff is quite charmed by the boy and curious about your interest in them. My interest is my own business. Of course, Your Majesty. Marcus didn't look even slightly chastened. I've prepared a special dessert for the boy, chocolate cake with vanilla ice cream. Every child loves chocolate cake. How do you know? Because I was human once too, remember? And I had children of my own before. He trailed off, the old grief flickering across his face before he smiled again. Trust me, the boy will love it. Gavril wanted to ask more about Marcus's human children, about what it had been like to lose them to time and mortality. But Kira and Tobias arrived before he could, and suddenly nothing else mattered. Tobias was wearing what were clearly his best clothes, tiny dress pants and a button-up shirt that was slightly too big for him. His curls were carefully combed, though one rebellious lock kept falling into his eyes. He lit up when he saw Gavril. Daddy. You're here, he rushed forward, and Gavril found himself bending down to scoop the child up without hesitation. Tobias wrapped his arms around Gavril's neck. Mama said we had to dress nice because you're important. Am I dressed nice enough? You look very handsome, Gavril assured him, settling the boy on his hip as naturally as if he'd been doing it for years. But I told your mother that this wasn't a formal occasion. You could have worn whatever you wanted. Really? Tobias's face fell. I have a shirt with dinosaurs on it. I really like dinosaurs. Then tomorrow, you should wear the dinosaur shirt. We're coming back tomorrow too? Tobias's eyes went huge with delight. Really, really? Gavril looked over the boy's head at Kira, who was standing in the doorway looking both lovely and uncomfortable in a simple green dress. Her hair was down tonight, falling in soft waves around her shoulders. She met his gaze with a question in her eyes. Really, really, Gavril confirmed. If your mother agrees, can we, Mama? Please? Kira's expression softened as she looked at her son. We'll see, baby. Now what do you say to His Majesty for inviting us again? Thank you, Daddy, neither of them corrected him. Again, dinner was easier than the night before. Tobias chattered happily about his day. He'd played with blocks in the estate's small daycare center where servant children were looked after, and he'd made a new friend named Emma, who was 6 and could already write her whole name. Kira slowly relaxed, even laughing when Tobias described trying to build a tower as tall as Gavril and having it collapse on him. How tall are you anyway? Kira asked, then flushed. Sorry, is that rude to ask? I'm 6'4", Gavril said, which was exceptionally tall in the 17th century. I stood out considerably. You still stand out, Kira said, then looked like she wished she could take it back. Because of my height or because of what I am? Both, neither, I don't know. She took a sip of her wine, a very fine vintage that Gavril suspected she wasn't used to, and seemed to gather her courage. Can I ask you something, and will you give me an honest answer? I can promise to try. Why are you doing this? Really, I've been thinking about it all day, and I can't make sense of it. You could have anyone you wanted. Human or vampire, you're powerful, ancient, and yes, incredibly attractive. So why are you spending your evenings having dinner with a single mother and her 4-year-old son who keeps accidentally calling you daddy? Tobias had moved to the floor to play with a toy car Marcus had thoughtfully provided, giving them a moment of relative privacy. Gavril considered Kira's question, knowing she deserved an honest answer even if he wasn't sure he fully understood his own motivations. When you've lived as long as I have, most of life becomes repetitive, he said slowly. The same political games, the same power struggles, the same endless cycle of vampire drama that has repeated itself for centuries. I've had lovers, many of them, in the early years. But they all wanted the same thing, to be connected to power, to say they'd bedded the vampire king. It became hollow. He paused. Your son looked at me and saw someone to hold hands with. You look at me and see someone who might hurt your child, and you're terrified, but you're here anyway because you're trying to give Tobias something you think he needs. Neither of you wants anything from me except presence. That's not quite true, Kira said quietly. I do want something from you. Gavril tensed slightly. Here it came, the request for money, for special treatment, for something that would make this simple and transactional like everything else in his life. What do you want? I want you to be honest with us. If this is just a temporary curiosity for you, if you're going to get bored and disappear from Tobias's life, I need to know now, before he gets any more attached. Her eyes were fierce. I can handle being used. I've been used before, but my son has already lost one father who didn't want him. I won't let him lose another. The protectiveness in her voice called to something equally fierce in Gavril. I have no intention of disappearing, he said, surprising himself with the certainty in his voice. I don't know exactly what this is or where it's going, but I can promise you that I don't do anything halfway. If I'm in Tobias's life, I'm in it for as long as he and you want me there. But we're human. We're going to die, probably within your lifetime. How can you commit to something that's going to hurt you? Because everything worth having comes with the risk of loss, Gavril said. And because I'd rather have something real that hurts when it ends than an eternity of hollow relationships that mean nothing. Kira's eyes had gone suspiciously bright. She looked away, blinking rapidly. You can't just say things like that. Why not? Because it makes me want to believe you. And believing in things has only ever gotten me hurt. Gavril reached across the table, covering her hand with his. She startled at the contact but didn't pull away. His skin was cool against her warmth, a physical reminder of the differences between them. Then let me prove it to you, he said. Give me time to show you that I mean what I say. Mama, why are you crying? Tobias had abandoned his toy and was now standing next to Kyra's chair, his small face creased with concern. Did Daddy say something mean? You shouldn't make Mama cry, he informed Gavril with the severity only a 4-year-old could muster. You're right, Gavril said seriously. I apologize. I should be more careful with my words. It's okay, baby, Kira said, wiping her eyes. These are happy tears. Sometimes grown-ups cry when they're happy. That's weird, Tobias announced. But okay, can we have dessert now? Marcus chose that moment to arrive with the chocolate cake. And Tobias's concerns about adult emotional responses were immediately forgotten in the face of a dessert that was nearly as big as his head. Kira caught Gavril's eye and mouthed thank you across the table, and Gavril felt that crack in his chest widen a little more. They fell into a routine after that. Every evening at 6, Kira and Tobias would come to the private dining room for dinner. Sometimes Gavril had to handle urgent business and arrived late, but he always came. Tobias never stopped calling him Daddy, and Gavril never corrected him. Neither did Kira. The estate staff quickly adjusted to the new normal. Gavril caught whispers and speculative looks, but no one dared to question him directly. His counsel was less subtle. Lady Seraphine requested a private meeting 1 week after the dinners began. "My lord, we need to discuss these humans you've been spending time with." Gavril didn't look up from the report he was reviewing. "What about them?" "The staff is talking. Other vampires are taking notice. There are rumors that you've taken a human lover and her child under your protection." And Lady Seraphine's frustration was palpable. "And it's unseemly, my lord. You're the vampire king. Having dinner with servants is one thing, but allowing a human child to address you as father crosses into territory that could undermine your authority." Now Gavril did look up, and his expression was cold enough to make the ancient vampire take a step back. "Are you suggesting that showing kindness to a child undermines my authority?" "I'm suggesting that blurring the lines between vampire and human, between ruler and servant, sets a dangerous precedent. What message does it send if the vampire king himself cannot maintain proper boundaries?" "It sends the message that I do as I please," Gavril said softly, dangerously. "Or have you forgotten who rules here?" "Of course not, my lord. I merely worry about your worry is noted and dismissed. Unless you have legitimate concerns about security or legal matters, my personal time is my own business." Lady Seraphine clearly wanted to argue further, but wisely chose to retreat instead. After she left, Gavril sat alone in his office, her words echoing uncomfortably. Was he blurring lines? Yes. Was it dangerous? Possibly. Did he care? Not even slightly. The truth was, those dinners had become the highlight of his day. Watching Tobias's excitement over small things, a new toy, a story Gavril told him about the old days, the way shadows danced on the wall. Talking with Kira, learning about her life, her dreams, the small struggles and triumphs of existing as a single mother, in a world that wasn't always kind to people in her situation. She'd been a student once. She told him one evening while Tobias dozed on a couch that Gavril had moved into the dining room specifically for these moments. She'd been studying education, wanting to be a teacher, but then she'd gotten pregnant and her boyfriend had left, and her family had cut her off for refusing to give the baby up for adoption. She'd dropped out of school and worked 3 jobs to support herself and Tobias until she'd been too exhausted to function. The position at the estate had been a lifeline, good pay, housing included, and a safe place to raise her son. "I don't regret Tobias for a second," she'd said fiercely, "but sometimes I wonder what my life would have looked like if I'd had support, if his father had stayed, if my parents had chosen me over their disappointment." "Their loss," Gavril had said, meaning it absolutely. "You're remarkable, Kira. What you've built for your son with no help from anyone is more impressive than most things I've seen in 3 centuries. She'd looked at him like he'd given her something precious, and Gavril had realized with startling clarity that he wanted to keep giving her things. Not material possessions, though he could certainly provide those, but moments of peace, of safety, of not having to carry everything alone. He was falling for her. The realization should have been terrifying. Instead, it felt inevitable, like recognizing something that had been true all along. 2 weeks into their routine, Tobias asked the question that changed everything. They'd just finished dinner, and Gavril was reading to the boy a nightly tradition that had developed naturally. Tobias was curled up in his lap, fighting sleep, when he suddenly looked up at Gavril with serious eyes. "Daddy, are you going to marry Mama?" Gavril's voice faltered mid-sentence. Across the room, Kira froze in the act of sipping her tea. The silence stretched out, heavy with implications. "Why do you ask?" Gavril said carefully. "Because Emma at daycare said that daddies and mamas are married, but you and Mama aren't married. Does that mean you're not really my daddy?" The fear in those small eyes was palpable. Tobias had been abandoned by one father already. Gavril could see the worry that it might happen again written all over the child's face. "Marriage is complicated," Gavril said, aware that Kira was watching him intently. "People can be families in lots of different ways. What matters is that people love each other and take care of each other. Do you love Mama?" There it was. The question that couldn't be deflected or answered with careful political neutrality. Gavril looked at Kira over Tobias's head and saw his own uncertainty reflected back at him along with something else, hope, want, fear of both. "Yes," Gavril heard himself say. "I do." Kira's teacup clattered against its saucer. Tobias, oblivious to the tension, brightened immediately. "And does Mama love you?" All eyes turned to Kira. She'd gone pale, her knuckles white where they gripped her cup. When she spoke, her voice was barely audible. "Yes." The word hung in the air like a miracle. Tobias, satisfied, snuggled back against Gavril's chest. "Then you should get married," he announced with the simple logic of children. "That's what people who love each other do. It's time for you to go to bed." "Sweetie," Kira said, her voice trembling. "Say goodnight to Gavril." It was the first time she'd used his name, and somehow that felt more intimate than anything else that had passed between them. Tobias was too tired to protest. He let his mother carry him out, but not before extracting a promise from Gavril that he'd be there for dinner the next night. Kira returned 10 minutes later to find Gavril still sitting in the same chair, staring at nothing. "I'm sorry," she said immediately. "He shouldn't have put you on the spot like that. He's 4. He doesn't understand. Did you mean it?" Gavril interrupted, standing to face her. "What you said. Do you actually love me? Or were you just telling him what he wanted to hear?" Kira wrapped her arms around herself, a defensive gesture he'd come to recognize. "Does it matter?" "Yes." He moved closer, giving her plenty of time to step away. She didn't. "It matters more than anything." "Of course I love you," she said, her voice breaking. "How could I not? You've been nothing but kind to my son. You've treated me like I'm someone important instead of just a servant. You've made us feel safe and valued and wanted for the first time in years. But loving you doesn't change reality. You're vampire royalty who's going to live forever, and I'm a human woman who's going to be old and gray in a few decades. This can't work." "Why not?" "Because it's impossible." "So was a human child deciding I was his father," Gavril said. "So was the 300-year-old vampire king falling in love with a woman he met because she was employed to clean his floors. So was any of this, and yet here we are." He reached out slowly, giving her every opportunity to pull away, and cupped her face in his hands. She was so warm, so alive. Her pulse fluttered under his fingers like a trapped bird. "I'm tired of impossibilities defining my life," he said softly. "I'm tired of doing what's expected instead of what I want. And what I want, Kira Harper, is you. You and your stubborn courage and your fierce love for your son and the way you look at me like I'm just a man instead of a monster or a king." "You are just a man," she whispered. "A man who happens to be a vampire and a king, but still just a man underneath it all." He kissed her then, gentle and questioning, giving her every chance to push him away. Instead, she melted into him, her arms coming up to wrap around his neck. She tasted like the tea she'd been drinking and something uniquely her, and Gavril felt the last walls around his heart crumble completely. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, though only one of them technically needed to breathe, Kira laughed shakily. "This is insane. Your council is going to lose their minds." "Let them," Gavril said. "I've spent centuries doing what was politically expedient. For once I'm going to do what makes me happy, and I make you happy? You and Tobias both, more than I've been in longer than I can remember." Kira's expression grew serious. "Then we need to talk about logistics. Really talk. Because there are real problems here, Gavril. I'm human. I'm going to age and die. What happens when Tobias grows up and realizes that his father isn't human? What happens when people outside the estate find out the Vampire King has taken up with a housemaid? What happens if your enemies decide to use us against you?" They were all valid concerns, and Gavril had been thinking about them constantly for days. "There are options," he said carefully. "For the mortality issue, I mean." Kira's eyes widened. "You mean becoming a vampire? It's not a decision to be made lightly, and it's not something I would ever pressure you toward. But yes, it's possible. If you chose it, and Tobias would have to make his own choice when he's old enough. No ethical vampire turns a child. But we could cross that bridge when we come to it." Gavril guided her to sit down, taking the chair next to her. "As for the other concerns, my council can complain all they want. I'm the king. My word is law. If I choose to be with you, that's the end of the discussion." "That seems like it might cause problems." "Probably," Gavril agreed, "but nothing worth having comes without complications. You taught me that." "I did?" "You walked into my life with a 4-year-old son and no apologies for the space you took up. You didn't try to make yourself smaller or more convenient. You just existed, fully and completely, and demanded that the world make room for both of you. That's brave, Kira. Braver than most vampires I know." She leaned her head against his shoulder, and Gavril wrapped an arm around her, marveling at how perfectly she fit against him. "What do we tell Tobias? The truth. That I love his mother, and I love him, and I want to be in both of your lives for as long as you'll have me." He's going to ask about marriage again. "Then maybe we should discuss whether that's something we'd want." Kira pulled back to look at him, her eyes wide. "Are you serious?" "I've never been more serious about anything." Gavril took her hand, threading their fingers together. "I know it's fast by human standards, but I've lived a very long time, Kira, and I've learned to recognize something real when I find it. This is real. We've known each other for 2 weeks. I've known you were important from the first moment you burst into the foyer looking for your son. Everything since then has just been confirmation." Kira was quiet for a long moment, her thumb tracing circles on the back of his hand. "My parents always told me I made decisions too quickly, that I jumped into things without thinking them through. That's how I ended up pregnant and alone at 21. This isn't the same situation, isn't it? I'm falling into something impossible with someone I barely know." "You know me," Gavril said firmly. "Maybe not everything about my past or my political positions, but you know who I am. The man who reads to your son every night. The man who makes sure you eat properly because you tend to skip meals when you're stressed. The man who listens when you talk about your dreams and doesn't dismiss them as impossible." He paused. "And I know you. The woman who would face down a vampire king to protect her child. The woman who works herself to exhaustion to give Tobias a good life. The woman who sees past what I am to who I am. When you put it that way, 2 weeks does seem like enough time to know what matters, Kira admitted. She took a shaky breath. Okay, let's do this. Let's be insane together. Date me properly or whatever the vampire equivalent is. Let's see where this goes. And if it goes where I think it might, then yes, I would consider marriage. Eventually, when we're both sure. Relief and joy flooded through Gavril in equal measure. He pulled her close again, breathing in the scent of her vanilla and something floral, and underneath it all, the warm human scent of life and blood. I'm already sure, he murmured against her hair, but I can wait until you are too. They stayed like that for a long time, wrapped in each other and the impossible future they were choosing despite all the logical reasons to walk away. Eventually, Gavril walked Kira back to her apartment, stealing kisses in the quiet corridors where none of the staff would see. At her door, she pulled him down for one more kiss, deeper and more promising than the others. Good night, Gavril, she whispered. Good night, love. Her smile could have lit up the entire estate. Then she slipped inside, and Gavril was left standing in the hallway with his heart, his supposedly dead, immortal heart beating fast enough that he could almost believe he was human again. The next few weeks passed in a blur of cautious happiness. Gavril courted Kira with the focused intensity of someone who had waited centuries for something real. He took her on walks through the estate's grounds after Tobias was asleep, showing her the gardens that bloomed only at night. He arranged for her to have time off and hired a trusted babysitter so they could have dates, real dates, away from the estate and the watching eyes of his household. They went to art museums where Gavril could tell her firsthand about pieces he'd seen created. They went to quiet restaurants where Gavril ordered food he couldn't eat just to watch Kira enjoy it. They went to a late-night movie, and Gavril experienced the novelty of sitting in a dark theater with a beautiful woman leaning against his shoulder, her hand in his. The physical aspect of their relationship progressed slowly, both of them aware that they needed to be careful. Gavril's vampire nature meant his strength and speed could be dangerous if he wasn't constantly vigilant, but Kira trusted him completely, and that trust was a gift he treasured more than anything in his considerable wealth. The first time they made love was 1 month into their relationship. Gavril had converted a spare room near his chambers into a proper apartment for Kira and Tobias, larger than the servant quarters, with a separate bedroom for Tobias decorated with dinosaurs and space themes. The boy had been ecstatic, and Kira had cried when she saw the care Gavril had put into making it feel like home. That night, after Tobias was safely asleep in his new bedroom, Kira had come to Gavril's chambers. She'd been nervous, her heart beat quick and her hands trembling slightly when she knocked. Gavril had opened the door to find her standing there in a simple nightgown, her hair loose around her shoulders. I'm sure, she'd said before he could ask. I've been sure for weeks. I just wanted to wait until it felt right, and tonight feels right. Gavril had drawn her inside, closing the door softly behind her. We can go as slowly as you need. I don't want slow, Kira had said, surprising him. I've been careful and slow my whole life. For once I want to just feel without overthinking everything. So he'd loved her carefully but thoroughly, attentive to every sound she made and every flutter of her pulse under his lips. He'd traced the map of her body like it was sacred territory, learning what made her gasp and arch into his touch. She'd been perfect, responsive and brave, and so alive it made his chest ache. Afterward, she'd curled against him, her fingers tracing idle patterns on his chest. Your heart doesn't beat, she'd said sleepily. No, but somehow you still feel warm. Not as warm as a human, but not cold either. We regulate our temperature based on our surroundings, Gavril had explained, running his fingers through her hair. It's another adaptation. Makes it easier to blend in. Do you miss it? Being human? The question was one he'd asked himself countless times over the centuries. I used to, he'd admitted. In the early years, I mourned everything I'd lost. The ability to walk in sunlight, the simple pleasure of eating food, the possibility of growing old with someone. But I've had so long to adjust that most of the time I barely remember what it was like to be anything other than what I am. And now, do you wish you were human so you could grow old with me? Gavril had turned to face her fully, his red eyes serious in the dim light. No, because if I were human I'd be dead. I wouldn't have lived long enough to meet you. Kira had smiled at that, soft and sad. The timing would have been pretty off, wouldn't it? Considerably. He'd kissed her forehead. Besides, you haven't decided whether you want to grow old or not. The option to become vampire is always there if you choose it. Would you want me to? Be honest. I would love you either way, Gavril had said, meaning it absolutely. If you chose to remain human, I would treasure every moment we had and mourn you properly when you were gone. If you chose to turn, I would spend eternity showing you everything this long life can offer. Both paths have their merits. Both would make me happy as long as they made you happy. She'd been quiet for a long time after that, and Gavril had thought she'd fallen asleep, but then she'd whispered, "I think I'd choose to turn. Eventually. Not right away. I want to watch Tobias grow up as a human, make his own choice without feeling pressured. But after that, yes. I think I'd want to stay with you." Gavril's arms had tightened around her, his face pressed into her hair. "We have time to decide," he'd said roughly. "Years and years to decide." "Good," she'd murmured, "because I plan on spending them all with you." But of course, complications arose. They always did. The trouble started with an unexpected visitor, a vampire lord named Draven from the European territories. He arrived without warning one evening, sweeping into the estate with an entourage of armed guards and political advisors. Gavril received him in the formal throne room, a space he rarely used but which was designed to intimidate visiting dignitaries. Draven was old, nearly as old as Gavril himself, with the white hair and red eyes of their kind. But where Gavril carried his age with controlled power, Draven wielded his like a weapon. He was dramatic and dangerous in equal measure, known for his quick temper and quicker violence. "Gavril." Draven greeted him with a smile that showed too many teeth. "It's been too long." "Not long enough," Gavril replied mildly. "To what do I owe this unexpected visit? Can't an old friend drop by without an ulterior motive?" "We're not friends, and you always have an ulterior motive." Gavril leaned back in his throne, the picture of relaxed confidence even though every instinct was screaming danger. "State your business or leave." Draven's smile widened. "Very well, I've heard interesting rumors about you, my lord. Stories of the great vampire king falling in love with a human housemaid. Surely such gossip couldn't possibly be true." The throne room went silent. Every vampire present tensed, waiting to see how Gavril would respond to such a blatant provocation. Acknowledging a relationship with Kira would invite scrutiny and potential danger. Denying it would be a betrayal of everything they'd built together. Gavril smiled, cold and sharp. "My personal life is none of your concern." "Oh, but it is," Draven said, moving closer with the fluid grace of a predator. "You see, the vampire king's choices affect all of vampire society. If you're consorting with humans beyond the usual feeding relationships, if you're elevating a servant to a position of importance, it sets precedents. It makes other vampires question the natural order." "The natural order," Gavril repeated softly, his voice dropping to a dangerous register. "And who exactly determines what's natural? You? Tradition, law, the way things have always been done. Traditions change, laws can be rewritten. And the way things have always been done is only the way things will continue if no one has the courage to do differently." Gavril stood, and though Draven was tall, Gavril still had a few inches on him. The height advantage, combined with the sheer presence of power Gavril radiated, made Draven take an involuntary step back. "I am the vampire king. My word is law in these territories. If I choose to be with a human woman, that is my prerogative, even if that choice makes you weak, makes you vulnerable." "Love doesn't make one weak," Gavril said, his voice carrying to every corner of the room. "It makes one fierce. It gives one something to protect, something worth fighting for. I've spent centuries fighting for political abstractions and territorial disputes. For once I have something real." Draven studied him for a long moment, then shook his head. "You're a fool, Gavril. Humans are temporary, fragile. She'll be dead before you know it, and you'll be left with nothing but grief. Then I'll grieve. But at least I'll have lived first. You've existed for centuries, Draven, but when was the last time you actually lived? When did you last feel anything real beyond hunger and ambition?" The question clearly struck a nerve. Draven's expression hardened, his fangs showing in a threat display. "You'll regret this choice. When your enemies realize you have a weakness, they'll exploit it. The woman and her child will become targets." "Let them try," Gavril said, his voice dropping to a lethal purr. "Anyone who threatens what's mine will discover exactly why I've remained vampire king for as long as I have. You included." The threat was unmistakable. Draven held Gavril's gaze for a moment longer, then inclined his head in acknowledgement. "As you say, my lord, I hope your confidence isn't misplaced." He swept toward the door, his entourage following. At the threshold he paused. "Oh, and Gavril, your council doesn't support this relationship. They're too afraid to say so openly, but they see it as a liability. Watch your back." Then he was gone, leaving a heavy silence in his wake. Lady Seraphine approached carefully. "My lord, is it wise to have made such a public declaration? If word spreads, it will spread." Gavril interrupted. "That was the point. Let every vampire in every territory know that Kira and Tobias are under my protection. Let them know that anyone who threatens them threatens me directly. But my lord." "That's the end of this discussion," Gavril said flatly. "Resume your posts. I have other matters to attend to." He left the throne room and went directly to the apartment he'd made for Kira and Tobias. He needed to see them, to reassure himself that they were safe. The door was unlocked. He'd have to talk to Kira about security, and he could hear laughter from inside. Tobias was running around the main room with what appeared to be a blanket tied around his neck like a cape. while Kira chased him with exaggerated slowness. The boy squealed with delight when he saw Gavril. "Daddy, I'm a superhero. I have super speed and I can fly." "Very impressive," Gavril said, catching the boy as he launched himself forward. "What's your superhero name?" "Captain Tobias," the boy announced proudly. "And I protect people from bad guys. A noble calling," Gavril said seriously. He looked at Kira over Tobias's head and saw her smile fade as she read his expression. "Can Captain Tobias play in his room for a few minutes while I talk to Mama?" "Okay." Tobias agreed readily. "But then will you read me a story before bed?" "Of course." Once Tobias had disappeared into his room, Kira moved closer, her face creased with concern. "What happened?" Gavril explained about Draven's visit, watching her face go pale. When he finished, she sank onto the couch, her hands trembling. "He threatened us. He implied that others might." "There's a difference." "Is there?" Kira looked up at him, fear bright in her eyes. "Gavril, I knew there would be complications, but I didn't think about actual danger. What if someone tries to hurt Tobias to get to you?" "They won't succeed," Gavril said firmly, kneeling in front of her. "I'm increasing security throughout the estate. I'll have guards posted outside your apartment at all hours. You and Tobias won't go anywhere without protection. That's not a way to live. It's temporary. Once word spreads about my declaration, most vampires will fall in line. The few who don't," he let the sentence trail off meaningfully, "you'll kill them, if necessary." Gavril took her hands in his. "I need you to understand something, Kira. I love you. I love your son. I would burn down the entire vampire world before I let anyone hurt either of you. But that means you need to trust me to keep you safe. Can you do that?" She was quiet for a long moment, clearly wrestling with the reality of what their relationship meant. Finally, she nodded. "Yes. But Gavril, if this ever becomes too dangerous, if being with you puts Tobias at real risk, then we'll reassess," Gavril said, though the thought of losing them made his chest tight. "Your son's safety comes first." "Always our son," Kira corrected softly. "He thinks of you as his father, and honestly, so do I." The words hit Gavril harder than any threat Draven could have made. Our son. A child who wasn't his by blood but who had chosen him with the simple certainty of innocent love. A child he would die to protect. "Our son," he agreed roughly. "And I will protect him. Both of you. Whatever it takes." They stayed like that for a long moment, foreheads pressed together, drawing comfort from the contact. Then Tobias called out from his room, asking if it was story time yet, and the intensity of the moment broke. Gavril went to read to the boy, choosing a story about brave knights and protective dragons, while Kira watched from the doorway with an expression that was equal parts love and worry. Later that night, after Tobias was asleep and Kira had reluctantly gone to bed, Gavril stood watch outside their apartment. He'd assigned guards, yes, but he didn't fully trust anyone else with their safety. Not yet. Marcus found him there around midnight, carrying 2 cups of blood. "Thought you might need this," the older vampire said, offering one to Gavril. "Thank you." Gavril accepted the cup gratefully. He hadn't fed properly in days, too focused on Kira and Tobias to attend to his own needs. Marcus leaned against the wall beside him. Words already spreading about Draven's visit. "The whole staff knows you claimed the woman and her child publicly. Good, is it, Gavril? I say this as someone who's known you for decades. Are you sure about this? Humans are wonderful, but they're also fragile. The boy is just a child. If something happens to them because of your position, then I'll handle it," Gavril said flatly. "I'm aware of the risks, Marcus, but I'm not walking away from them." Marcus sighed. "I didn't think you would. You always were stubborn." He paused. "For what it's worth, I think she's good for you. You've been more alive these past few weeks than I've seen you in decades. And the boy is precious. Reminds me of my own children before you lost them to time, yes." Marcus's expression was distant. "I had 3 children when I was human. I watched them grow old and die while I remained unchanged. It nearly destroyed me. I couldn't love anyone after that, couldn't risk that pain again." He looked at Gavril. "But watching you with Tobias, seeing how happy they make you, it makes me wonder if I made the wrong choice, if love is worth the inevitable loss." "I think it is," Gavril said quietly. "I think maybe that's the whole point. To love deeply despite knowing it won't last forever. To treasure something precisely because it's temporary. And when the woman dies, when the boy grows old, then I'll grieve. But I'll also have had them in my life, and that will be worth any amount of pain." He glanced at Marcus. "Kira is considering turning, eventually, after Tobias grows up and makes his own choice." Marcus's eyebrows rose. "She'd give up her humanity for you? Not just for me, for herself. For the chance at more time, more experiences, more life." Gavril smiled slightly. "She's braver than most vampires I know. She'd have to be to take you on," Marcus said dryly. "You're not exactly an easy man to love, no, but she does anyway." They stood in comfortable silence for a while, 2 ancient beings keeping watch over the fragile humans they'd grown to care for. Eventually, Marcus excused himself, and Gavril was left alone with his thoughts and his determination to protect the impossible family he'd somehow acquired. The days that followed Draven's visit were tense. Gavril increased security throughout the estate, assigned his most trusted guards to watch over Kira and Tobias, and made it clear to his council that any threat to them would be met with immediate and severe consequences. Most of the council fell in line, though Lady Seraphine continued to voice disapproval. "This is madness, my lord," she said during a private meeting. "You're painting a target on their backs. Every enemy you've made over 3 centuries will see them as a way to hurt you. Then my enemies will learn a valuable lesson about the cost of threatening what's mine," Gavril said coldly. "I'm done with this conversation, Seraphine. Accept my decision or resign from the council. Those are your options." She chose to stay, though her disapproval remained evident. But Gavril had more important concerns than managing his council's opinions, like teaching Tobias about the realities of living in a vampire's world. The conversation happened one evening about 2 weeks after Draven's visit. Tobias had asked, with a child's blunt curiosity, why there were always guards outside their apartment now. Gavril and Kira had exchanged a glance, and Kira had nodded slightly. It was time. "Tobias, we need to talk about some grown-up things," Gavril said, sitting down so he was at the boy's eye level. "Can you listen carefully?" "Okay," Tobias said, his small face serious. At 5 now, his birthday had been a major celebration. He was old enough to understand more than he had when they'd first met. "You know that I'm a vampire, right? We've talked about that." "Yeah. You drink blood instead of eating food, and you can't go out in the sun." "That's right. But being a vampire also means that some people don't like me very much. And because you and your mama are important to me, some of those people might try to hurt you to make me sad." Tobias's eyes went wide. "Bad guys, like in my stories, sort of like that. Which is why we have guards now. Their job is to keep you and mama safe. Will the bad guys come here? I don't think so. But if they do, I'll protect you, I promise." Tobias was quiet for a moment, processing. Then he said, with the simple faith of childhood, "Okay, I trust you, Daddy." The title still sent a warm jolt through Gavril's chest every time he heard it. He pulled the boy into a hug, feeling small arms wrap around his neck. "I love you, Tobias. You know that, right?" "I love you too, Daddy. And I'm not scared because you're really strong and you'll beat up any bad guys who try to hurt us." Over Tobias's head, Gavril met Kira's eyes. She was watching them with an expression of such love and trust that it made him ache. He would not let anything happen to them. He would not. The weeks turned into months, and gradually the tension eased. No attacks materialized. Word of Gavril's public claims spread through vampire society, and most vampires were smart enough to respect it. Draven returned to his European territories and made no further trouble. The estate settled into a new normal, with Kira and Tobias firmly established as part of Gavril's household. His relationship with Kira deepened. They talked about everything: her dreams for Tobias's future, Gavril's centuries of experiences, the practicalities of a human-vampire relationship. She met more of his council and staff, earning respect with her intelligence and her refusal to be intimidated. She started taking online courses again, working toward finishing her education degree, and Gavril supported her completely, even hiring tutors when she needed extra help. Tobias thrived. He grew taller, started school in the estate's educational program for staff children, and continued to call Gavril Daddy with unself-conscious love. Gavril taught him to read, helped with homework, attended school events, and discovered that fatherhood, even the informal, chosen kind, was both more challenging and more rewarding than he'd ever imagined. And through it all, the question of marriage hung in the air, unspoken but present. Gavril brought it up one evening about 6 months into their relationship. They were in his private garden, a space he'd opened only to Kira and Tobias. Tobias was asleep in the apartment with guards posted, giving them rare time completely alone. "I want to marry you," Gavril said without preamble. "Properly, publicly. I want everyone to know that you're mine and I'm yours." Kira, who had been admiring the night-blooming flowers, turned to face him. "That's not very romantic," she said, but her eyes were bright with emotion. "Would you prefer I get on one knee and recite poetry?" "Maybe a little," she admitted with a smile, but then her expression turned serious. "Are you sure, Gavril? Marriage it's permanent, or it's supposed to be. And with everything that's happening, with the danger and the politics." "I'm sure," Gavril said, moving to take her hands. "I've been sure for months. The question is whether you are." Kira looked down at their joined hands, her warm skin against his cool paleness, human and vampire, so different and yet fitting together perfectly. "I'm sure," she whispered. "I'm terrified, and I have no idea how we're going to make this work long term, but I'm sure that I want to try, with you, always with you." Gavril did drop to one knee then, because some gestures were worth making. He pulled a small box from his pocket. He'd been carrying it for weeks, waiting for the right moment. Inside was a ring he'd commissioned from the estate's jeweler, a simple band of white gold with a single perfect diamond, elegant and understated. "Kyra Harper," he said formally, "will you marry me? Will you let me be your husband and Tobias's father in truth as well as in heart? Will you build a life with me for however long or short that life may be?" Yes, Kyra said, laughing and crying at the same time. Yes, yes, 1,000 times yes. He slid the ring onto her finger and stood to kiss her, deep and sweet and full of promise. When they broke apart, she was shaking. We're really doing this, she said. We really are. Your council is going to have opinions. They can keep them to themselves. Gavril tucked a strand of hair behind her ear. Unless they want to find themselves looking for new positions in the wedding, how does a vampire king even get married? However we want, Gavril said. It can be a huge formal affair with hundreds of guests, or it can be a small ceremony with just the people who matter. Your choice. Kira considered. Small, she decided. Intimate, just the people we love. I don't want this to be a political spectacle. Small it is. Gavril kissed her again, unable to resist. Though we should probably tell Tobias soon. He's been asking about marriage for months. They told him the next morning. Tobias's reaction was everything they could have hoped for, pure, unfiltered joy. He jumped up and down, shouting about how his daddy and mama were getting married, and that meant they were a real family now. Then he asked if he could be in the wedding, and if he could wear a suit like a grown-up, and if there would be cake. Yes to all of the above, Gavril assured him, lifting the excited boy into his arms. In fact, you're going to have a very important job at the wedding. What job? You're going to be my best man. That's the person who stands next to me and makes sure I don't forget the rings. Tobias's eyes went huge. Really? I can do that. I'm really good at remembering things. Kira laughed, her eyes shining with happy tears. Yes, you are, baby. You'll be perfect. They planned the wedding for 1 month later. It was a small affair, held in the estate's private chapel with only a handful of guests, Marcus and a few other trusted staff members, 2 of Kira's friends from her online classes who made the trip, and a very reluctant Lady Seraphine who attended out of duty if not enthusiasm. Tobias took his role as best man incredibly seriously. He wore a miniature suit that matched Gavril's, practiced walking down the aisle for days beforehand, and barely fidgeted during the ceremony itself. When it came time for the rings, he handed them over with enormous pride, and only minimal fumbling. Kira was breathtaking in a simple white dress that made her look like she was glowing. She'd left her hair down the way Gavril liked it, and her smile as she walked down the aisle toward him could have lit up the entire estate. Gavril, who had seen countless beautiful things over 3 centuries, still felt his breath catch. The ceremony itself was short and sweet. Traditional vows with a few modifications to acknowledge the unique nature of their relationship. When the officiant, a vampire elder who had performed marriage ceremonies for centuries, pronounced them husband and wife, Gavril kissed his new bride with all the love and promise he'd been holding in his chest for months. Tobias cheered loudly and several guests laughed. It was perfect. The reception was held in the same dining room where they'd shared their first dinner together, now decorated with flowers and candles. There was cake chocolate for Tobias, vanilla for the human guests, and blood-infused desserts for the vampires. Music played softly in the background, and for a few hours it felt like the outside world and all its complications didn't exist. Gavril danced with his new wife, holding her close and marveling at the fact that this was real, that after 300 years of existing without truly living, he'd found something worth fighting for, someone worth changing for. What are you thinking? Kira murmured against his chest. That I'm the luckiest man who ever lived, Gavril said honestly. Living or undead. She laughed softly. Smooth talker. I mean it. You've given me everything, Kira. Purpose, joy, a family. I don't know what I did to deserve you, but I swear I'll spend the rest of our lives, however long they may be, proving that I'm worthy of the gift. You already have, she said, pulling back to look up at him, just by being who you are, by choosing us when you could have had anyone or anything, by loving my son like he's your own. He is my own, Gavril said firmly. Biology doesn't matter, he's mine. Ours, Kira agreed, her smile radiant. I like the sound of that. They danced until Tobias interrupted, insisting that he wanted to dance with both his mama and his daddy. So they took turns spinning him around the dance floor while he giggled with delight, and Gavril couldn't remember the last time he'd felt so completely, perfectly happy. Later that night, after the guests had left and Tobias was asleep, Gavril and Kira stood together on the balcony of his, now their chambers, looking out at the estate grounds bathed in moonlight. What happens now? Kira asked softly. Now we live, Gavril said. We raise Tobias. We deal with whatever challenges come. We love each other through all of it, and eventually I'll have to decide. About turning. Eventually, not today. Not until you're ready. Kira turned to face him, her expression serious. I think I'm ready now. Gavril's hand tightened on the balcony railing. Kira, we've talked about this. You wanted to wait until Tobias was grown. I know what I said. But I've been thinking about it for months, and I don't want to wait. I don't want to spend decades dreading the inevitable. I don't want to watch Tobias grow up knowing that every year takes me closer to leaving you both. I want to do this while I'm still young, while I still have time to adapt and learn how to be what you are. She took his hands. I want forever with you, Gavril. Why wait? Because it's permanent. Once you're turned, there's no going back. You'll never see sunlight again. You'll never taste food the same way. You'll have to drink blood to survive. Your entire existence will change. I know, and I'm still sure. She squeezed his hands. Turn me, please. Make me what you are so we never have to say goodbye. Gavril searched her face, looking for any trace of doubt. He found none, only love and determination and absolute certainty. And Tobias, he'll see you change. He'll know what happened. We'll explain it to him. He's smart, he'll understand. Kira smiled. Besides, he already adores you. Having a vampire mama too won't change that. You really are sure? I've never been more sure of anything in my life. So Gavril did something he'd only done a handful of times in 3 centuries. He turned someone. He took his wife to a private room, made sure she was comfortable, and carefully bit into her wrist. Not to feed, but to drain just enough blood that her body would be on the edge of death. Then he offered her his own blood, the ancient powerful blood of a vampire king, and she drank without hesitation. The transformation took 3 days. 3 days of Kira lying in a death-like sleep while her body changed at a cellular level. 3 days of Gavril watching over her, barely leaving her side, terrified that something would go wrong. 3 days of explaining to a worried Tobias that Mama was going to be different when she woke up, but she'd still be Mama, and she'd still love him just as much. When Kira finally woke on the 4th evening, her eyes had changed from warm whiskey brown to deep crimson red. Her skin was paler, her features somehow sharper and more defined. She was breathtaking in a way that no longer belonged entirely to the human world. How do you feel? Gavril asked, taking her hand carefully. New vampires could be unstable, struggling with bloodlust and sensory overload. Strong, Kira said, her voice slightly different, richer, with an almost musical quality. Everything is so intense. I can hear everything, smell everything. And I'm so thirsty. I know, we'll take care of that. Gavril helped her sit up slowly. But first, do you regret it, the choice? Kira looked at him with those new red eyes and smiled, showing the sharp fangs that had developed during her transformation. Not even a little bit. I feel like myself, just more. Is that strange? Not at all. That's exactly how it should feel. Gavril kissed her gently, relieved beyond measure that the transformation had gone smoothly. Welcome to immortality, my love. They had to explain the changes to Tobias carefully. The boy was initially frightened by his mother's new appearance. The red eyes and pale skin were jarring for a 5-year-old who had only known his mama one way. But Kira was patient, letting him approach in his own time, proving that she was still his mother despite the physical changes. Do you still love me? Tobias had asked in a small voice, standing several feet away from her. More than anything in the whole world, Kira had assured him, her new vampire hearing picking up his rapid heartbeat, her new vampire vision seeing the fear and confusion on his face with perfect clarity. Nothing about how I feel has changed, sweetie. I'm still your mama. But you look different, I know. But think of it like when a caterpillar turns into a butterfly. It looks different on the outside, but it's still the same creature inside. I'm still me. I still love you more than chocolate cake and dinosaurs and everything else combined. That had gotten a small smile out of him. Even more than Captain Tobias' adventures, even more than that. Slowly, Tobias had approached, letting his mother pull him into a hug. You're really cold now, he'd observed. I am. Is that okay? I guess so. Daddy's cold too, and I like hugging him. Tobias had pulled back to study her face seriously. Do you drink blood now like Daddy? Yes. But never from people I love and never from anyone who doesn't want to share. Just like Daddy, okay. Tobias had seemed to accept this with the resilience of young children everywhere. Can I still call you Mama? Always, Kira had said, her voice thick with emotion. Always, baby. The adjustment period was challenging. Kira had to learn to control her new strength and speed, to manage the constant thirst for blood, to navigate a world that looked and sounded completely different through vampire senses. But Gavril was there every step of the way, teaching her, guiding her, helping her adapt to her new existence, and slowly their life settled into a new rhythm. Gavril and Kira ruled the estate together, a true partnership that brought new perspectives to vampire politics. Tobias continued to grow, adapting to having 2 vampire parents with remarkable ease. They became a true family in every sense of the word. Years passed. Tobias grew from a small boy into a teenager, then a young man. When he was 25, the same age Gavril had been when he was turned, he made his own choice. He chose to become vampire, to join his parents in immortality, unable to imagine a life where he would age and die while they remained unchanged. Gavril and Kira gave him the same careful consideration they'd given each other, making sure he understood exactly what he was choosing. And when Tobias confirmed that yes, this was what he wanted, they granted his request. The transformation was just as successful as Kira's had been, and when Tobias woke as a vampire, his first words were, "This is amazing, I can finally keep up with you in training sessions, Dad." Gavril had laughed, rough with emotion, and pulled his son into a hug. His son, not by blood but by every other measure that mattered. The small boy who had wandered into a council meeting and decided the Vampire King was his daddy, now a vampire himself, strong and capable and choosing to stay with them forever. "I'm proud of you," Gavril had told him. "I've been proud of you since the day you held my hand in front of my entire council and didn't let go. I knew you were my dad even then," Tobias had said with a grin, "even when nobody wanted to admit it." "Best decision you ever made," Kira had added, joining the embrace. "Adopting us both." And it was true. That moment in the foyer so many years ago when a small hand had slipped into his and a childish voice had called him Daddy had changed everything. It had cracked open Gavril's carefully controlled world and let in love, chaos, family, and purpose. He'd been the Vampire King for over 3 centuries, had accumulated more power and wealth than most beings could imagine, had seen empires rise and fall. But none of it compared to this, standing in his home with his wife and son, both vampires now, both choosing to spend eternity by his side. "I love you both," Gavril said, his voice rough with emotion. "More than I have words to express." "We love you too, Daddy," Tobias said, using the title he'd never stopped using despite now being an adult vampire himself. "Always have, always will. Forever and always," Kira agreed, her red eyes shining with the same love that had been there when they were whiskey brown. And so they lived, the family that shouldn't have existed but did. The Vampire King, his housemaid wife, and the small boy who had called him Daddy in public and changed the course of all their lives. They faced challenges together, celebrated triumphs together, and built a life that was rich with love and purpose and the simple, extraordinary joy of choosing each other, day after day, century after century, because in the end, that's what family was. Not blood, not biology, but choice. The conscious decision to love someone, to stand by them, to build a life together despite all the logical reasons why it shouldn't work. And their family worked perfectly. Not because it was easy, but because they refused to let it be anything else. Years turned into decades, then centuries. The world changed around them, but their love remained constant. Other vampires came and went, some accepting their unusual family, others disapproving, but none able to deny the strength of the bond they shared. Kira became a skilled vampire in her own right, earning respect within vampire society for her intelligence and diplomatic skills. She eventually took a position on Gavril's council, bringing new perspectives to centuries-old problems. Tobias grew into a formidable vampire, strong and confident, eventually taking on responsibilities within the estate's security forces. And through it all, they remained a family. They still had dinners together, though now no one ate food and they all drank blood. They still laughed and argued and made up. They still held each other through difficult times and celebrated the good ones. Sometimes, late at night, Gavril would stand in the foyer where it had all begun and remember that day. The council meeting interrupted by a small boy, the warm hand slipping into his. The single word Daddy that had changed everything. He'd been alone for so long, isolated by power and immortality and the weight of responsibility. He'd forgotten what it felt like to be needed for something other than his crown, to be loved for who he was rather than what he could provide. And then Kira and Tobias had entered his life and reminded him. They'd shown him that even a 300-year-old vampire king could still grow, still change, still find new reasons to live rather than just exist. "What are you thinking about?" Kira asked, appearing beside him in the foyer as if summoned by his thoughts. Even after decades, his heart still skipped when she appeared. "The day we met," Gavril said, pulling her close. "The day everything changed. Because a 4-year-old called you Daddy and you didn't correct him," Kira said with a smile. "Best mistake you never made." "It wasn't a mistake," Gavril said seriously. "It was the first truly right thing I'd done in centuries." Tobias joined them, now centuries old himself but still their son in every way that mattered. "Are you two being sentimental again?" he asked with mock exasperation. "Because it's very sweet but also kind of gross." "Respect your elders," Gavril said, but he was grinning. "You mean respect my parents," Tobias corrected. "Which I do, excessively. So much respect. Can we move on from the mushy stuff now?" Kira laughed, the sound bright and joyful. "Fine, fine. What did you want to talk about?" "Actually, I wanted to tell you something." Tobias suddenly looked nervous, which was unusual for a vampire who regularly faced down threats without flinching. "I met someone, another vampire, and it's getting serious." Gavril and Kira exchanged a glance. "Tell us about them," Gavril said. "Her name is Elena. She's from the Western Territories, works in vampire-human relations. She's smart and funny and beautiful, and I think you'll both really like her. And I wanted to ask," he trailed off, then seemed to gather his courage. "I wanted to ask if I could bring her home, to meet you. My parents." The emphasis on the word parents made Gavril's chest tight. After all these years, after everything, Tobias still claimed them as his parents with absolute certainty, and now he wanted to bring someone home to meet them, the way children had done for generations immemorial. "Of course," Kira said, her voice warm. "We'd love to meet her." "Really?" Tobias's relief was palpable. I was worried you might think it was too soon, or that you'd want to run some kind of background check on her. Or, Tobias, Gavril interrupted gently. We trust your judgment. If she's important to you, then she's important to us. Bring her home whenever you're ready. Tobias's grin could have lit up the entire estate. Thank you, both of you, for everything. For taking me in when I was just a stupid kid who didn't understand what I was doing. For loving me anyway. For giving me this life. You weren't stupid, Gavril said firmly. You were brave. You saw what you needed and you reached for it without fear. That's the opposite of stupid, and we didn't give you anything, Kira added. You gave us everything. A family, a purpose, a reason to keep fighting through the centuries. They stood there together in the foyer, three vampires who had started as the most unlikely family imaginable and had become something unbreakable. The vampire king, his wife, and their son, bound not by blood but by choice, by love, by the conscious decision to be family every single day. And when Tobias eventually brought Elena home to meet them, and the young vampire proved to be everything he'd said and more, Gavril and Kira welcomed her with open arms, because that was what family did. They grew. They adapted. They made room for new love while honoring the old. The story could have ended 1,000 different ways. Gavril could have corrected Tobias that first day, could have maintained proper boundaries between king and servant. Kira could have pulled her son away and apologized profusely, could have kept her distance out of fear. They could have let logic and propriety and all the reasons why it shouldn't work dictate their choices. But they hadn't. They'd chosen the impossible instead. They'd chosen love, and in the end, that choice had given them everything. A family that spanned centuries, a love that defied mortality, a life that was rich with meaning and purpose and joy. Some stories begin with once upon a time. This one began with a small boy calling a vampire king daddy in public, and neither of them correcting him. It was the beginning of everything, of family, of love, of a life that none of them could have imagined but all of them cherished beyond measure. And they lived happily ever after, forever and always, exactly as they'd chosen.